Okay, so we have 4 panelists here. And I'll just introduce them as we go through. Okay.
That's right.
All right. Okay. She was born ready. Okay, are you all ready? Kathy's going to get her presentation on. Let's do it.
Great, thank you. Right, so my name is, well, it says Catherine, but please call me Kathy. I'm from the University of Alberta. And I'll just preface this talk by saying that it is methodological and is part of my ongoing project to find links between media ecology and phenomenology. So when technology is successfully integrated into practice, whether in our personal or professional lives, it withdraws into the taken for granted background of our everyday involvements with the world around us. Checking email on my smartphone, for example, I pay little attention to the familiar blue and white envelope icon as I tap on it. And in doing so, sorry, I'm just going to grab my smartphone. I certainly am not thinking about the device itself, its OS, the Wi-Fi connection, the global networks that together assemble this communicative possibility. Instead, my focus is on whether I have any new messages, on reading and responding to them, but not on the technology itself. The hardware, software, the larger infrastructure supporting me are quietly sunk into what I'll call my ready-to-hand equipmental background, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But when a technology breaks, acts unpredictably, or is unexpectedly absent, I suddenly wake up to its material presence or absence, to the practices and activities that it affords me, and to my surprising reliance on it for the generally seamless and uninterrupted flow of my everyday life. But the electricity goes out, there's no air conditioning, our car won't start, we lose our keys, we drop our smartphone, and in the wake of such untimely events, the broken or missing technology leaps out of the background and into the foreground of our attention. Our world may grind to an unexpected halt, our current projects disrupted or foiled. Such moments of breakdown catch us unguarded in the midst of our taken for granted involvement with the things around us. Yet such untimely events also afford the alert observer unique aperture into our ongoing co-relational engagements and tacit conversations that we have with our material surround. For this reason, studying breakdowns, glitches, accidents, anomalies, whether naturally occurring, induced, or imagined, is a common investigative practice among research approaches that aim to uncover our human-technology-world relations. And these approaches include actor network theory, and here I would refer you to Bruno Latour's Aramis project, ethnomethodology, Harold Garfinkel's breaching experiments, media ecology, and there's multiple ones here, but I belong to education, so I like the McLuhan-Hutchin and McLuhan-Sidious classroom project. Phenomenology, Martin Heidegger's Broken Hammer and Being in Time, and finally post-phenomenology, so Don Idey's many fine analyses of technologies in use where he uses imaginative variation. Latour, for example, writes that much of the ANT scholar's fieldwork is to multiply such occasions of breakdown in order to render objects and the work that they are doing visible. For Heidegger, too, a breakdown not only renders the thing in question visible, but it also lights up the relational web in which it is acting. Indeed, paying close attention to what transpires when a technology breaks, malfunctions, acts unexpectedly, or is simply missing is also core to one of phenomenology's favorite methods called the eidetic reduction. The eidetic reduction recognizes that every phenomena obtains its unique identity via its differences from other related phenomena, or it is originally constituted or marked by what it is not. I'm just going to do another strip here. Heidegger's analysis of a broken hammer is an excellent example of phenomenology's eidetic reduction. In Being in Time, Heidegger shows that we human beings in the world, or Daseins, are always already tangled up in and engaged with the things or equipment of our worldly surround, that is, with what is nearest to us. This engagement or concernful dealing with nearby things is most ordinarily and primordially ready to hand. So what is this? And this is a quote from Being in Time. So Heidegger says, equipment can genuinely show itself only in dealings cut to its own measure. So hammering with a hammer, for example. And in such dealings, an entity of this kind does not grasp thematically as an occurring thing. The less we just stare at the hammer thing, the more we seize hold of it and use it, the more primordial does our relationship to it become. And the more unveiledly is it encountered as that which it is, equipment. And the hammering itself uncovers the specific manipulability, or Handlichkeit in German, of a hammer. And we call this mode of relation readiness to hand. That is, when we tend to encounter a thing, not as an object as such, but as part of an ongoing and intimate rapport with our world. This ready-to-hand mode of primordial engagement is ontologically fundamental. That is, proximally and for the most part, we Dasein are lost to our everyday world. And it's only when a thing becomes plucked out of its undifferentiated entanglement in its environment and exhibited, for example, if it suddenly breaks, does it become present at hand. That is, an object that is understood as separate from us. Well, how does this ready-to-hand to present-at-hand relationship happen? And I'll just note on here that we're more familiar with the idea of figure and ground, and that's a rough mapping, okay, of those. So when I reach for my smartphone and discover it is completely dead or is missing, suddenly I become acutely aware of it as a material object that doesn't work, right? As an object, the smartphone shows up, phenomenologically speaking, as something distinct and other. And an object, Willem Flusser tells us, gets in the way, a problem thrown in our path like a projectile. The present-at-hand object, okay, so the figure object, is conspicuous and obstinate, a thing temporarily torn from its equiprimordial relational context. Okay, so that's the ground, or our everyday relational interaction with the world. Such entities, as Sylvia Benso describes, have lost their connections, their web of relations and references, no longer a place of intersections. They are taken in isolation from Dasein and from other things. So entities that disclose themselves as present at hand or figure become still life objects. Entities deprived of the dynamism and vitality coming from the possibility of multiple intersections or references. And in socio-material discourse, this is when an object as actor is suddenly pulled from its network of associations and thus is made visible or unblack-boxed. Now, Eric Pickersgill's photographic collection, Removed, illustrates such a present-at-hand shift moment due to absence. In his photographs, human subjects are captured in the candidness of the quotidian, so lying in bed, dining at a restaurant, driving through the city, each intimately involved with their mobile phones. But in the photographs, the devices have been removed from the subject's hands, and here the viewer is provoked to reflect on the comportment and devoted focus of the subjects, on their relationships with others and to the world around them, and on the broader significances of this now ubiquitous technology. In the phone's absence, its web of relations becomes momentarily evident, that is, less taken for granted. And as McLuhan, Hutchin, and McLuhan point out, it's actually not Cydia's classroom, it's another article somewhere else. The method of observing by suddenly removing a particular technology or figure draws attention to the side effects, which are the ground of that figure. Okay, so it's pointing directly to this readiness to hand, which is exactly where we can discover the effects and influences of a particular technology. So the absent figure, here the mobile phones, this is another picture skill photograph, makes the otherwise hidden and taken for granted ground, that is the media web of relations, that the mobile phone gathers evident. So one reliable way to catalyze or experience this figure ground shift is to remove the technology of interest from practice for a period of time. In other words, simulate a background. And for this reason, this is a favorite exercise in media classes, to unplug or abstain from using specific technologies, say for 24 hours, in order to perceive what these technologies may have been doing in our lives. Well, why does this approach work? Well, in order to grasp the technology's technologizing influences and atmospheric intoxications, we must necessarily be in it, that is, intimately involved with and immersed in using that particular technology. But when we are immersed, we are necessarily directly and immediately subject to, and thus, and McLuhan would, I know he said this, we are asleep to a technology's radiating web of effects. So an unexpected technology breakdown, so it could be bodily injury or even abstention, can momentarily awaken us sleepy users. I call it, phenomenologically speaking, we'd say pre-reflective users, absorbed in our everyday and unreflective, naive contact with the world. That's a term from Merleau-Ponty. And so what we're doing is awaking from our artificially induced trance. Such wakeful jolts, while disconcerting, can also provide unique aperture into the whole situation as it was being lived just moments before. It still resides in our memory. So from the vantage of the broken tool moment, we can observe retrospectively the now severed web of relational connections to our world. That is, the technology's unique lines of force as they withdraw and pull back along the relational trajectory. Further, we can test this moment by trying to do things we were able to do previously. That is, when the technology was in play. What can't we do anymore? And then observe what happens. This method can reveal in even more detail the network of support that is now lost, but nonetheless belongs to the tool, or was convened by the tool when we are in our usual ready-to-hand mode, relational mode with it. And in line with the etymological roots of the term reduction, so this is from phenomenology, and people often get this term wrong. The phenomenological reduction aims to restore, and that's actually what the etymology is. That is to reassemble and resemble the originary phenomena in its lived wholeness. So we're not looking for the object, but what we're looking for is our relational moments of engagement. And this sometimes surprising meaning of the reduction is also evident in medical terminology, which I discovered. Reduction is the name of a surgical procedure for resetting a broken bone, that it is the process of restoring a bone to its original form, placement, and functioning. Likewise, in phenomenology, the reduction aims to lead us back to life in its pre-reflective wholeness as it was originally lived. And so to conclude, I'll just give you a brief example and then I'll point you to the paper that this particular example is in. So 2 summers ago, so this is my hand, while investigating digital writing technologies, I fell and fractured a bone in my left writing hand. In this instance, not the technology, but the human being broke. After my hand had been surgically reduced, that is, the bone reset, put in a cast to heal, and I use this occasion to perform a phenomenological or eidetic reduction in order to draw a bit closer to the shifts in lived experiences from writing with a pen to writing with a keyboard and software, etc. And here's just a brief excerpt from the paper. So, I tried shifting the pen to my right or non-writing hand, to sign a document that required my original signature, or to make a few napkin notes in the middle of a conversation. But I quickly discovered that writing with my right hand was awkward and laboriously slow. I know you all know this. My penmanship was either illegible or appeared like that of a careful 6-year-old child. Nonetheless, as I struggled to write, I was surprised at how my right hand seemed to know the shape and physiognomy of each letter as it was striving to perform. Now, from this little moment, I discerned that orthographic literacy adheres in one's whole body, but it is most finely expressed in one's hands, for example. And here's the paper if you're interested in it, and here's where I write more about this. So, proceeding via this broken tool approach, a technology may be observed retrospectively in its most taken for granted, ready-to-hand moments. Whether studying an outright breakdown or puzzling over momentary glitches, or breakdowns can provide ripe opportunity to witness digital and non-digital things in motion, intertwined with and caught up in our everyday practices, and more particularly the unique but invisible lines of force they exercise in our lives. Thank you.
Mary Rothschild, for viewers.
I am Mary Rothschild, and primarily I come to you from the front lines of those who live with and teach very young children. I had a nonprofit that I founded called Healthy Media Choices that works with parents and teachers of very young children about the intentional use of media, and I kind of also teach media to children and adult life professionals. Not me. So I wanted to just share with you some of the observations from those contexts and questions that arise for me in this kind of fulcrum of trying to come to practical strategies really on the ground in life, as Corey Anton would say, an ecological perspective of everyday life is what I'm looking to find and to bring practical tools. First of all, when we look at children birth to age 6, why do we look at them? The first 6 years of life is a particularly dynamic time of neurological development. It's the most dynamic time in life. The first 2 of those 6 years is the most sensitive. And during that time is kind of a dance between neurological connections made, and a dance between environment and genetic predisposition. So the environment calls, probably a lot of people familiar with this, it calls genetic predisposition in certain ways, depending on the environment. If you have a genetic predisposition, something's going to show up or not. So these very dynamic and structural formations are pivotal to the question of worldview. Among other things, this evolving neural structure determines our ability to attend. Attention that we pay, yes, focus, but also attention situates us within a larger universe, separate but connected, both with ourselves and with each other. This is the basis, from my point of view, for spiritual, but not necessarily religious development, in the sense of connection with whom we were meant to be, our place in the universe. Psychologist Michael Poster finds in his research that attention is a system in the body, just like respiration, digestion, and its structure is neurological. So this early, very early, healthy neural development, really is pivotal. So if we take that, if we accept that for a moment at least, what questions arise? What do we need to look at? First of all, how do we speak about technology and media in young children's lives, in the society? And what I see are 2 different narratives that go on. The first is puts the child in the center of the question. We can call this the health model. Media and technology are examined as influencing parent awareness, speech development, quality of nutrition, economic well-being, and impacting the child's physical, emotional, and intellectual development. Those who speak from this child-centered focus are primarily pediatricians, psychologists, and neuroscientists who have made recommendations which they have somewhat modified recently, but basically have reinforced that there be no screen time at all in the first 18 months of life. And after that, they have recommendations for slowly introducing media over the next 4 years till elementary school. The second perspective that centers on child plus media technology at the center of consideration as a given generally includes communications researchers and others whose interests studying how children use technology from a research interest and also from a profit motive. The second is the dominant narrative in the society. It is framed as empowerment by technology. Phraseology developed by academics to make sense of our present condition or by marketers to promote early technology use. Phrases such as marketers' assertions that children are born with a digital gene now, Prensky's labels of digital narratives and digital immigrants, the need for children to be prepared for a digital future in the digital world, all drown out, they overwhelm the message of reflection, delayed gratification, sacrifice, and healthy development posed by what we call the health model. It also drowns out any other narrative of what children need to be prepared for the future. For instance, a model that would be built by someone from a climate change research perspective. They might have a very different opinion about what children might need to know for the future. The fact that we are, in fact, living, breathing, feeling beings on a living, breathing planet, and the future is by definition unknown, is eclipsed. What we are calling the health model is marginalized in the popular media and culture and in media criticism. And there's a parallel, this is the question, is there a parallel here with the marginalizing of the care perspective in philosophy and ethics, especially ethical philosophy, promoted by people like Annette Baer. This care philosophy is often associated with a maternal perspective. And Carol Gilligan, in her review of Michael Sloat's The Ethics of Care and Empathy, which advocates for taking care seriously and giving it centrality in the discourse about ethics, attributes this to the prerogatives of patriarchal society. It's a question. Evidence ascribing hysteria to concern for young children and thus marginalizing it is seen in the popular press, such as the New York Times, where articles on children in media are usually relegated to the style pages, formerly known as the women's pages. Right alongside articles about how many children have died of gunshot wounds in the United States recently, as of June 2017, 25 per day. But isn't care exactly what we see has ignited some pivotal conversations recently around children in media? Sherry Turkle dates the time she had a seismic shift in thinking about robotics to a conversation with her own daughter about whether robots were alive enough to do what sleeping turtles were doing. After the death of her husband and the need to find ways to support resiliency in her children, Susan Sandberg found and popularized the work of the Center for Myth and Ritual in American Life at Emory University about the connection between knowledge of faith and ethnic stories and resiliency in teens. It's a question. I forgot about timing, so I have to skip some. So this narrative of technology as progress, as empowering, has filtered down into the organizations that make policy for education of young children. National organizations of teachers of young children now advocate for inclusion of digital media in child care and preschool situations that directly contradict the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends. And their policy statements are actually written in conjunction with media makers. We have to look at some of the, so that's kind of a policy part. We have to look at some of the other narratives that are actually bringing children into what Kathy might call being born as non-reflective users. The atmosphere of there's an app for that. I was recently at a presentation by a very renowned communication scholar, and there were many things to challenge in her presentation, but one of the profound things was that she said, on the one hand, that parents shouldn't just rely on the fact that they had their children, their new children, to think of themselves as experts. They needed to look to people like her who had done the research as the experts. And then 5 minutes later, she scoffed at the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations. So she was challenged during the Q&A. How could these two things coexist? We need experts, and yet she scoffed and dismissed these recommendations. And she said, with alarming frankness, well, we're not looking at those effects because we're here to make money. Now, she might have said something different in the Media Ecology Association conference. She was talking to the Children's Media Association. So we have this generalized atmosphere of not only acceptance but privileging of technology as becoming a necessity for very young children. The earlier the better. If they need it for their future, parents who are very concerned about doing that for their kids think the earlier must be better. All right, so in terms of spiritual development, the thinking that there's an app for that, this researcher, for instance, was challenged by someone on an assertion she had made. This teacher, many years of teaching, said in her experience, children have much less awareness of how to situate themselves. They don't know about, like, if the sun is in a certain position, what time of day it is, sort of basic orienting abilities. And she paused and she held up her smartphone and said, well, but I don't get lost as much in it. She didn't seem to understand, because of the care, about the difference between being able, having it in yourself to be able to navigate the world, and having an app. And to another of Kathy's points, battery might die. Right. She didn't seem to recognize that. All right, so another point is, this clock is like 25, 30 minutes, so I have to skip things. Reflection and the ability to be still. It's kind of ironic that the tech industries have found methods of critical thinking and reflection useful, while they're diminishing in the culture generally. This is a quote from, I don't have her name here, but one of the stellar tech people. One of the things that user experience research has done in depth provides is it gives you a moment where you can see something you know, like you're seeing it for the first time, like you can have a moment where it's new or where it's unexpected or awful. Neil Postman points to the continuing relevance of the wisdom of the ages to apply to any situation humankind faces. One such example is from Astrov's study of American Indian prose and poetry. She notes that in the present American culture, a mother is concerned if her child enjoys solitude and reflection, whereas the traditional Lakota education includes deliberate training in quietude. The child is taught to sit still and to enjoy it, to smell, to sense the surroundings, listen to silence and observe when nothing seems to be happening. In this way, the child does not fear the emptiness of the world, which modern children have been trained to escape, but see the world as alive and that they are a part of it. The narratives from the popular culture, the few ones I have here, that I hear as concerns, and in my studies I see as predominant are, you can never have enough stuff. You can never look good enough, and violence is an acceptable way to solve conflict. And the new and emerging and very strong one is there's a pill for everything. There's an app for that, and there's also a pill for that. The pharmaceutical companies there's probably a apocryphal story among communications people of a child, 5-year-old boy who went to the pediatrician for a well childhood checkup and said, "Is Cialis good for me?" And the pediatrician said, "What?" And he said, "It's said to ask your doctor if Cialis is good." So, all right, so environment is media, just very briefly. One of the things that is coming into my, partly as a grandmother, but also my undergraduate students, they're wonderful questions, is that the environment as media is the other children. The logos on their clothing. My 4.5-year-old grandchild has never seen a movie, has never had a television. She only has a little iPad for FaceTiming, primarily with me and my husband, and an app for math. But she knows all of the Disney characters. She insisted she had to have something from Ella, even though she has no clue. Because the other children are part of her mediated environment. And this is coming into focus in terms of how to speak in practical terms about what it means when a kid just loves, dog duck. And so you buy dog duck sheets that they're going to wake up in, dog duck slippers that they're going to put on their feet, dog duck backpack. So that immersion of media symbolism in the child's life is such a relief. Oh, I guess I'm out of time. But there is hope. I do want to end on a hopeful note. First of all, the questions to my undergraduate students, I'm always pulled over this. So, that generation is terrific as far as I'm concerned. They're really, really very caring questions. But also, I have seen that through a thoughtful process, a reflective process in workshops, that based on research, bringing the research, that parents and teachers of children can come to their own very tailor-made practical strategies for how to navigate this world and have their children feel they are part of their culture, which of course they need to feel. So anyway, thank you for being here.
Good stuff. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And the truth is, I'm really happy to be here today. It gives me a chance to share some connections, both back to my home discipline, which is philosophy, and also to my teaching. I think I have some nice things to say about my students too, so I appreciate that. But just for a bit of orientation, I wanted to start by returning to a fundamental idea of Neil Postman's. This is from Amusing Ourselves to Death. And very early in the book, he begins to make an argument that our forms of communication encourage particular epistemologies, including important ideas about knowledge and intelligence and truth. This is an argument to which he devotes an entire second chapter. Sometimes I think the second chapter is the most important chapter in a book. After the introductions are over, here come the important ideas. But even as you read through the book, one gets a sense that this is a really important idea to him. And I sometimes do think it might be the most important point in Amusing Ourselves to Death. And just to briefly sort of frame this as quickly as I can, echoing the work of Walter Ong, Postman explains that what he calls an oral culture, a culture without written language, in other words, an oral culture captures and stores and transmits its shared basic knowledge in its memorized proverbs, sayings, parables, and so on. People in these kinds of cultures can't write things down, of course, or keep them on their phones or their laptops, because they don't have these technologies. Nonetheless, they have lots of knowledge, and in an oral culture, knowing is remembering these proverbs and sayings and so on, Postman argues. On the other hand, in what Postman calls a print culture, the tools of typography allow people to capture and store knowledge in written language. So in a print culture, knowledge doesn't have to be limited to what's in people's heads. It's external, in a way, in books and journals and notes and so on that people write and that they print. And so with these kinds of examples in Chapter 2, Postman argues that the primary medium within a culture can shape that culture's definition of knowledge. And of course, knowledge is a central concept in philosophy. The part of philosophy that deals with epistemology, especially, we sometimes call epistemology the theory of knowledge or philosophy of knowledge. So starting there, he's already made some headway. But medium also has implications for another dimension of epistemology, which is intelligence. In an oral culture, if knowledge consists of those memorized proverbs and so on, this means that important elements of what we call oral intelligence will include a strong memory, a strong storytelling skill, aphoristic ingenuity, the capacity to write these stoic stories and proverbs and sayings and so on. This is what constitutes intelligence in an oral culture, Postman argues, again, echoing on here. Meanwhile, print cultures capture and store knowledge in writing. They see intelligence differently. They see intelligence largely in terms of literacy and logic and abstract thinking skill, Postman argues. And so he sort of sums this all up in a couple of different ways, but I thought this was a helpful quote to drive it home. What a culture means by intelligence is derived from its important forms of communication. This is the kind of point that he's trying to get to there, I think, in chapter 2. And what he's doing here, I think, is launching a deep conversation about oral cultures and print cultures, all to set up these ideas, of course, that he wants to get to. They're referenced, I guess, in the book cover here. He's got ideas about televisual cultures, which will, of course, have their own distinctive conceptions of knowledge and intelligence that are shaped by the medium of television. This is the MEA. I love to talk about television, I suppose. But what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my talk today is what we might call the digital culture of our contemporary and likely future media environment, and on what we might call the digital epistemology that it encourages. When I talk with my students about digital epistemology, I try to suggest that this might be one of the great issues of our time, and certainly one of the great issues of their time as well. I really believe this, and it was Postman who helped me to see it. So, asking the question, what is digital epistemology, is a great place to start a million different interesting conversations. And I have to be honest, I don't think we really know yet what the digital epistemology is or will be. So we're going to have to work on this a bit. But one Postman-led way to frame it would be to step back and ask, what, if any, types of messages, what, if any, types of intellectual skills the digital media environment encourages. How are these similar or different from those of the televisual environment or the typographic environment or even the oral environment, right? This was the strategy that Postman was using as he set up these kinds of epistemological points in chapter 2. And I have to say, I picked up some additional inspiration here from our featured speaker in Denver in 2015. This was Nicholas Carr, for those of you who were there or those of you who are familiar with his work. He's done a bit of work in the shallows and elsewhere that has led me in particular to see skimming, multitasking, perhaps even visual communication as potential candidates for a digital epistemology, especially digital intelligence, if you will. So here's Carr. I'm just going to give you one quick quote from the shallows on skimming. If you compare this or contrast this with Postman's earlier points on the media environments of oral and print cultures, there's some interesting points we could develop here. When we go online, Carr writes, we enter an environment that promotes cursory reading, hurried and distracted thinking, and superficial learning. He's using terms here that suggest he's not too keen on this sort of reading and thinking and learning. But if we take a step back, we can see this as the kind of reading, thinking, learning that might be encouraged in a digital environment, for better or for worse, whatever that's worth. And then he had an earlier article in The Atlantic where I think you could see him striving to say something deeper. Not quite about epistemology, he doesn't use that language, but nonetheless it was related to the kind of argument that Postman makes in amusing ourselves to death. So here's one quote from here and then I'll move on to Carr. He writes, media are not just passive channels of information. They supply the stuff of thought, but they also shape the process of thought. And what the net seems to be doing is chipping away my capacity for concentration and contemplation. Again, he's expressing this in a way that's meant to sound alarm. But if you take a step back, which is the kind of strategy I think I take away from a lot of Postman's writings, and think about this not so much in terms of whether this is bad or whether it's good, but what do we gain and what do we lose? Here's a suggestion about the digital epistemology, if you will. So by bringing together Postman and Carr, I think we can start to discover some hints of what a digital epistemology might be. Though, again, just to be clear about this, I certainly don't have anything like a full digital epistemology to share with you today. I think this is an open question for lots of good future work to be done. But I thought it might be interesting to dial in on just one contender for digital epistemology that I've been developing in a little logic and epistemology manuscript of mine. When I first started it, I thought it had nothing to do with media ecology. But it turns out, I think, that it could be linked in some potentially interesting ways. And this contender, which, again, I'm trying out here as one potential element of a digital intelligence, is the ability to evaluate unsupported claims. That is, claims that appear without support, without any corroborating justification or evidence to back them up. These are different from proper arguments in that they're presented, again, without any evidence. There's nothing there to support it. So a claim all by itself might look like this. Every logic book that has ever been published seems to have a claim something like this one. Socrates is more, there's no argument here. It's a claim, it's a statement, it's the kind of thing that could be true or false. We could do some things with it, but on its own, it's not an argument. It only becomes an argument, or part of an argument, maybe is the safe way to put it, when we add another claim to work as either a premise or a conclusion. In this case, I'm adding a premise. Right? Socrates is mortal. Why? Because he's a human being. Add the premise here, and the original claim turns into the conclusion of a proper logical argument. Right? So the unsupported claim comes first here, the argument comes second. We can do this if you need another example. This one's a little more media focused. All media shape their content. Again, an unsupported claim. But arguments can be made when we take unsupported claims like that one, and we add, in this case, I'll add a conclusion. All right? All media shape their content. So TV, as a medium, shapes its content. Now we've got an argument. We added a conclusion to the original unsupported claim, and now we have a full premise, conclusion, argument. Postman talks about these kinds of logical arguments as being especially characteristic of the print-based media environment, and they remain key elements of academic work too, which is part of why I think they show up so often in critical thinking classes and texts. There you can take a look at the library of critical thinking books that have been published in recent years, and there's a whole category of them. They're simply focused on this kind of argument, analyzing and ultimately evaluating these kinds of arguments. I actually teach Postman as part of a first-year critical thinking course that runs kind of like that. We introduce these concepts, and then we apply them to Postman's own ideas on the theory that Postman is presenting an argument in amusing ourselves to death, and other writers are presenting, in some cases, further supporting arguments, and in other cases, counter-arguments to what Postman is doing. But it's essentially argument-focused in that way. And certainly I'd encourage the use of logical arguments in scholarship and in teaching, but the evaluation of unsupported claims seems to me to be a useful critical thinking skill as well, and maybe one that is underappreciated. But in our contemporary media environment, these kinds of unsupported claims are everywhere. And I honestly think we could all use some help in dealing with them. Messages are getting shorter, ever shorter. All right? They just can't carry proper logical arguments because they lack the capacity or the space to do them. And even if they have the capacity to do so, right, there's no reason to restrict the length of a message digitally. But often user conventions will discourage long, complex, sophisticated arguments. So when I first started sort of cooking this up, I was reflecting on my own media consumption in my everyday life. And I realized that a huge part of what I look at every day now consists of unsupported claims. Certainly if you go to the New York Times website or any reputable journalism website, you'll find lots of examples of deep, sophisticated arguments made in news reporting and commentary and so on. But if you're just looking at sort of these typical feeds on the homepage, which is the kind of thing when I'm trying to make decisions about what sorts of stories to read, you get essentially lists of unsupported claims. It happens with my Facebook newsfeed too. Right? It happens, whatever this is worth, in the Google News aggregation lists that are returned as well. So much of this is just one unsupported claim after another. The headlines themselves are too short to carry full arguments, and so we really can only analyze and evaluate these things as unsupported claims. So they're out there, and they may be out there more than they have been. before. But in any case, here we are. And if this is on track, we may need to consider the identification and the evaluation of unsupported claims as important components of a digital intelligence. And again, I don't have anything earth-shattering to help here, but my students and I have been trying to develop a kind of procedure for thinking critically about unsupported claims. This is an inquiry-based approach that we're working on, so we focused on some of the key questions that critical thinkers might ask when they're faced with a claim, and the first of them is a really fundamental one. What does the claim say? Do we understand it? Can we grasp its meaning? And is it expressed in a way, maybe it has loaded language that leads us to accept it or reject it on its own, even without the argument in favor of it or against it. This is a really key point, and very often people express their claims in ways that might be unclear, or that might be prone to misinterpretation. And we need to be clear about what the claim says, I think, before we're going to think critically about it, especially if there's no supporting evidence around it to back it up. Certainly, we can ask good critical questions about the source as well, especially the source reliability, if we know it. This is something that's very helpful with the Google News aggregation lists. My students and I sometimes have conversations about the difference between a source like the Washington Post and a source like the Washington Times. They often show up next to each other, sometimes even in the same list. They report on the same story in the same day. But there are differences in terms of source credibility that are important to be on top of, or at least to ask about, to begin a conversation there. And then finally, there may be thought we can put into this where we ask questions about consistency of the unsupported claim with other reliable claims. The basic idea here is that if it is sort of radically inconsistent with something that we have a lot of confidence in, that may be a good reason to be suspicious of it. Again, I don't think there's anything earth-shattering here, but this is the kind of routine that we've been developing in the class, and if we can get into the habit of asking these kinds of questions, any of us, not just my students, but any of us, when we face an unsupported claim, I think we can begin to systematically and critically approach the unsupported claims that are so common in our digital media environment today. I've got 5 seconds. I'm going to stop there, I think. But I'd love to hear what you think, especially from a teaching perspective. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe. Next up, finally, but not least, Wilson Oliveira, who is also presenting on behalf of partner in crime, Marcia Christie D'Souza. Take it away.
Would you mind to take some
pictures
for another project? The ones who were at my presentation this morning will understand. I'm making a movie only with GIFs, and all my presentations I am asking people to photograph. Thank you. You can do whatever you want. I know my time is short, but I have to ask, apologize on behalf of Marcia. She's my partner in crime, as Brad said. We are husband and wife, and we got from Rio, and she's with a terrible jet lag sensation. We flew 15 hours from Rio to here. She woke up this morning terrible, and on her name I am asking you are kind. The idea here of this paper called Audiovisual Live Performance as a college practice and theory, Cinema's New Regions. The original idea was to join our PhD researches that we ended up on 2013. First time we went to a media college conference was 2012 on Manhattan College, and we presented a paper together there. That was the beginning of our partnership, uniting our researchers. She researched movie palaces and the death of old movie theaters in the urban landscape, and I was studying the so-called live cinema. This expression that showed up on a release of a famous technological festival in Germany, the Tamidial, and at that time when I first read that expression, I asked myself, has cinema one day have not been alive? And then this kind of gave birth to this. I'm here in a triple task. I presented a paper this morning, I'm presenting one now, and I'm launching McLuhan and Cinema with a foreword written by Eric McLuhan, so gentle, and Andrew McLuhan. The launching will be tomorrow, but anyone who wants it, I'm here today. And so the idea was to unite our research, and this idea lead us to a movie, a brilliant movie, a 3-hour-and-a-half structuralist movie called La Région Centrale, or the Central Region, by Michael Snow, a Canadian filmmaker that made this movie, and it's 3.5 hours of a landscape and a camera capturing movements by the command of a sound. And there is 3 or 4 minutes of this movie on YouTube. I'm going to show in the end of my presentation. So I have now 10 minutes because I'm going to show 2 minutes and the clock is looking at me. So my apologies on behalf of Marcia. The idea is that cinema is expanding a new informational setting. The language of new media has a new temporality, or as Letmanovich points, the loop as a narrative engine. But a new space, a territory detached, a geocinema, as we propose. Geocinema here, we are trying to develop some ideas of geophilosophy, of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, and unite it with Marshall McLuhan, with some Marshall McLuhan's propositions. And there is a very interesting paper by Peter Zhang, Thinking Deleuze and McLuhan, and the idea here is not to be that philosophical. It would take 10 papers of this to do so, but Deleuze on the beautiful Time Image book says that the artist is always in a position of saying at once, I claim new media, I claim new media, and I fear that new media nullify my will of art. And Michael Snow makes a structuralist movie that was exclusively to be projected on movie theaters about a landscape being filmed. At the same time, on the urban landscape, movie theaters were dying. These ambiguities can be understood along with Marshall McLuhan's idea that artists, especially the experimental ones, are counter-irritants at most. That's one of the best, beautiful terms McLuhan thought. And this counter-irritant idea with Deleuze's idea that the artist is always claiming new media but fearing new media because it would nullify their artist's will of art. It's experimenting, I think nowadays, a new idea for cinema, a new experience for cinema. We claim for cinema something, what we claim for cinema as content, narrative, or the ambient cinema took place for years. McLuhan has a beautiful long quote, allow me to read. It's of course to understand media. In terms of media study, it's clear that the power of film to store information is accessible form is unrevealed. Audio tape and videotape were to excel film eventually as information storehouse, but film remains as a major information resource. Arrival of the book whose technology it did so much to continue and also surpass. At the present time, 1964, film is still in its manuscript phase, as it were. Shortly, it will, under TV pressure, go into its portable, accessible, printed book phase. Soon, everyone will be able to have a small, inexpensive film projector that plays an 8mm cartridge. McLuhan mistakes was that it's not 8mm but digital. This type of development is part of our present technological inclusion. The present dissociation of projector and screen is a vestige of our older mechanical world of explosion and separation of functions that is now ending with the electrical implosion. End of quote. It was a little bit long, but it's important to think this because using other surface as a screen, making projection system understands space as information, as video mapping technology. When you map a surface and you project, reading the surface as data, changes and implodes cinema once more. The movie Central Region as an introduction to live cinema as media ecology theory. Any space, whatever, is a good Deleuzian synthesis to Michael Snow's works, and maybe to the experimental and structural film itself. In a certain way, Deleuze calls attention to a geocinematographic spatial possibility that live audiovisual performers are currently exploring it deeply. Deleuze says that Michael Snow's Central Region does not raise perception to universal variation of a savage matter without also extracting from it a space without reference, points where no ground and no sky, where no horizontal and vertical cannot inter-exchange. I think it will be an interesting complement showing the 3 or 4 minutes we got on YouTube of the Central Region microscopes. The extraction of other spaces interchanging on vertical and horizontal, making us watch a movie with our heads because the camera goes spinning, and so you have your body spins with the movie, and it's not a 360 degrees experience, but I'm sure these experiments has a lot to do with the experiment of Michael Snow. P. Adam Sidney, the greatest theorist of the structuralist movement cinema, names like Michael Snow, Boris Frampton, Stan Brakhage, and so on, and even Andy Warhol. Sidney situated Andy Warhol as a structuralist filmmaker. P. Adam Sidney says that this movie, the central region of the title is almost barren plateau, empty of people or any notice of its existence. The region is also the sky above. The camera sweeps in circles of 360 degrees, exploring with spirals that expand and contract and intersects, zooming, zigzagging, focusing the ground around its base, sliding close-ups, and the distance horizon with zooms. A presentation in cinema closer to a system naturae. And I think this is why I'm in this beautiful session here. Eddie changed me from another session from this. I think this idea of phenomenology of cinema starts here. Structuralist film, formal films like that bring us to an encounter with cinema itself. And in Michael Snow movie, the camera takes a human perspective on the landscape. As the film progresses, the specific possibilities of the camera apparatus are being used to examine the piece of land to an almost microscopic level of detail. Live cinema, this idea of DJing, performing live a movie, has much to do with that. And I think this movie and other Michael Snow's movie are kinds of lessons to think what has been called mediascape. This is a film about a landscape in media, in a film medium, And as I have less than 3 minutes, I think YouTube mini version of Michael Snow's film has 4 minutes. I'll be VJ and try to edit these minutes here live. See there? Oh, yeah, see the switches on it.
PC.
Oh, thank you. Oh, sure. The movie, when the reels were changed, this X stayed on screen, and this is idea of the central region. The camera will spin off during almost 4 hours of projection. Of course, I have only 2 minutes, and let me try to do this experience with you. Oh yeah, that's right. Of course, we don't have the same experience as a structuralist filmmaker would claim. On the contrary, I think Michael Snow would be really mad with me because I'm showing this differently from the idea original. Oh, that's great. Thank you. Now the sound is over. Michael Snow created with an engineer an equipment that when the sound was activated, camera would make a new set of movements. I'm gonna be I don't know if I should do this, but I'll do it anyway. Michael Snow said on an interview years later that the equipment broke during the footage of the film. They had to put the sound on the post-production. So I'm kind of being I think what a VJ do when he's mixing a film live is trying to somehow find this central region, this idea of cinema having as content not only narrative. McLuhan says that cinema is somehow an extension of novels, but overall an extension of the symphonic orchestra. So creating a movie by sound, I think, was the great idea of this beautiful Quebec region that Michael Snow found. And McLuhan and Cinema will be launched tomorrow. Anyone who wants, thank you very much. Sorry for my bad.
All right, we have some time for questions. Fun. We're getting stumped here. This is good stuff. Yeah.
The first question always brought.
I have colleagues who are artists and feel that the technology really is determining so much of what they can do. I mean, exactly, technological. And is this the fear that you were talking about? Yeah. That they just want to verify.
Not determinism, not something like that, but this idea that artists always claim for new media, but when new media arrives, what is going to be my wheel of art?
Is it going to? Is it going to? Yeah.
See, Kathy, wow, so cool that change of the meaning, not the meaning, but the sense of reduction. When we talked about reduction. Because yeah, the phenomenological reduction always gets kind of played out weird, obviously reasons for it, but
Yes.
I was playing with it as you were talking about it. So there's an introduction, and there is deduction.
Yes.
Induction.
Yes.
When you deduce, you're in it.
Yes.
And the reduction is getting put back in it.
That's right.
And so the phenomenological reduction,
Yes.
sense of reduction, isn't a reduction in the sense of reducing as you would a sauce.
Right.
A reduction, although that could be a distillation, a fine point to the figure of it.
Yes.
But a reduction into I was just like,
Nice.
whoa!
Yeah, it's thank you for that. It's a really important distinction, and so we can talk about different approaches to doing empirical research, and we can proceed by deduction or abduction, but phenomenology most definitely proceeds by reduction. But unfortunately, it also has that other meaning. And so thank you for that. And I have to say that when I broke my hand, all of these wonderful things came out of it, and that was one of them. I was so stunned to discover that this was called, and it was perfect because it does mean the same thing.
Yeah, that's what really.
Putting back to its original state as best as possible.
Yeah, that's a great way to do it. Now I can, like when I teach it, it's like, hey, check this out.
Let's say I broke my hand.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. It's anything
Hypothetically
else.
speaking.
So I'm trying to actually draw a thread across all of these. I really love this panel. It's really good. Thank you all so much. I'll just go through them in order, and then you can pick up and respond to them. What ties my own question together is attention to kind of habitual ways of thinking that are reproduced by structural repetition. Okay? So when I think about your work, Kathy, on present at hand, right, and I think about other frames of epistemology, right, like the notion of objective science by removing variables as a way to prove something, or Mary, in your work, you were talking about how the earlier the better for introducing digital technologies and that kind of money, right? And then I think about something like the experience of imperialism and language loss, right? So that that argument was the argument that my parents' generation made when they didn't pass on languages of origin because English was the legal front, right? And then, in your work, Gerald, I was thinking about what constitutes a reliable claim, because, very often what's reliable is also hegemonic, right? And then, coming to this wonderful, thank you very much for this paper on, sort of like the perspective of cinema, right, in that sort of central region. And, I think that it ties all these questions that I have together. When do we notice that the shift in perspective by whatever dimension that each of you are addressing, right? Whether it's in the developmental dimension or it's in, sort of the size of the claims, right, versus the logic behind them and so on. When do we notice that what we can know is being altered by the perspective that, the artist's question, what tunnel have we gone down now? Because of whatever the need is. So it just struck me that somewhere in here, an analysis of power, right, is really important. And so, I would welcome responses from you.
Next session, please. question.
That's a huge question. But really, it's about power, right?
2 in 1 minute.
It's, you know,
Well, what stands out for me is the word notice.
Yes.
How we notice, right?
Yeah.
And my own work started over 20 years ago when I noticed things about my own children
yes.
instead of following and inquiring. So I feel that this noticing, this being enough removed to notice,
Yes.
that fundamental action that we come into ourselves, meditation, all of us, and feel coming in enough so that we can notice is pivotal, and is pivotal to spiritual development. That's what I describe. So that's my, yeah, I don't, if somebody else wants to.
When I notice something, I think Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology is a phenomenology of perception. It includes the body. The perspective is not only an eye thing.
Yes.
The perspective for Michael Snow can be more than the camera eye of Ziga Vitol, for example. My contribution is always cinema. And such a nice question like that, it's nice to answer, thinking like a movie, perception of. All the time here I was dealing with this show or not showing, showing or not showing the strict minutes of a film that is not to be seen like that.